Rome woke long before the traffic lights blinked green at the foot of the Janiculum, well before the bakers unlatched steel shutters along the Borgo Pio, or the chestnut vendors lit their first coals, because history had shaken it awake as bluntly as a stone against stained glass. Somewhere in the city, a single church bell rang at 4:47 a.m., one clapper strike out of rhythm, the auditory equivalent of a dropped wine goblet at a royal banquet. People later claimed that bell was the world's advance warning. Then ancient heart had accelerated, startled by an incoming jolt of grace whose voltage no algorithm had yet measured. Whether you believe in prophetic bells or not, the jolt was real enough. It hummed beneath the cobblestones and skittered through the Wi-Fi routers, rattling coffee cups in far-off time zones, rousing reporters out of threadbare hotel linens, and nudging the eyes of 69-year-old American Pope open in the darkness of his private chapel. Robert Langley, Pope Leo XIV, to a flock so large it sometimes felt theoretical, breathed in incense thick enough to taste, and exhaled the name that had carried him since basketball courts in Chicago's South Shore. Jesus. He let the syllables linger a moment in the half-lit hush, tasting bittersweet memories of his mother's gumbo and his father's calloused hands gripping steering wheels on overnight shifts. The marble pressed cold against his knees, a deliberate discomfort reminding flesh that the spirit still had work to do. A beam of moonlight caught the edges of a worn silver pectoral cross. It threw fractured halos across the chapel floor like broken coins from a kingdom no conqueror could ever spend. He prayed first for the nameless. Mothers with no passports, fathers with no pay stubs, children with no bedtime stories except those whispered intents that flapped like dying lungs on windy step nights. He prayed next for the powerful. Prime ministers whose pens hovered above budget lines that might throttle aid, presidents whose speechwriters waited to smuggle kindness past lobbyists allergic to generosity. Finally, he prayed for the frightened, lumping himself into that category with unflinching honesty, because courage that denies fear is only vanity in cardinal red. Behind him, mahogany doors parted on silent hinges. Cardinal Paroline, face soft with the perpetual melancholy of a man who knew too many secrets to sleep soundly, bowed halfway and whispered, "They are at the gates, Your Holiness." Rossi leads them. He said nothing of the attaché case. He didn't need to. Its presence was a boom in the background hum of papal dawns. Without rising from his knees, Leo finished the sign of the cross and pressed 2 fingers to the cracked leather Bible lying open at Isaiah 58. The margins there were graffitied with decades of marginalia. Grocery lists jotted during college homily brainstorming, Greek word declensions he'd once taught seminarians, phone numbers of shelters in magnificent mile alleys, and a single line in Mildred Langley's looping script, "Stand where light hurts the eyes." He closed the book, kissed its spine, and slipped it under an arm trembling only slightly with age. Cardinal Paroline shadowed him down the corridor, cleated silence stretching between their footfalls. The Pope's white zacchetto glimmered like a dandelion puff in cathedral gloom. Guards saluted, frescoed saints watched, and somewhere in a distant salon an antique clock ticked with the vanity of believing it alone kept time in the Vatican. They entered the Sala Regia to find director Marco Rossi crisply silhouetted against dawn gold windows, 23 officials flanking him in 2 symmetrical columns, polished shoes aligned as though fear itself had issued a dress code. Rossi's father had raised him on stories of Roman legion discipline. That upbringing showed in the impeccable geometry with which he placed the attaché case on a bronze clawed table. But the careful posture could not extinguish the almost invisible pulse twitching in his neck, an involuntary semaphore of second thoughts. He introduced himself, though introduction was redundant, and presented the documents whose seals glimmered scarlet like fresh wax on a lover's letter. The text inside, later leaked to press, accused the Pope of undue influence on sovereign legislation, potential destabilization of border protocols, and rhetorical incitement likely to compromise national security objectives. In simpler English, "You spoke mercy too loudly, old man. Governments prefer mercy muffled." While aides whispered urgency about legal immunities and diplomatic protocols, Leo turned pages with the deliberateness of priests turning Eucharistic wafers. His eyes flicked across paragraphs dense with legalese. Somewhere midway, he paused at the phrase bold humanitarian posture, used as if it were an indictable offense. A soft chuckle escaped him, an unusual sound at the epicenter of international crisis. He glanced up. Director, my mother used to tell me trouble arrives dressed in its Sunday best. But underneath the suit, it's usually just scared. The cardinal beside him stiffened at the informality. Rossi blinked like a flashbulb had fired in his face. The attaché's lid clicked shut, yet the echo reverberated all the way through Vatican courtyards and on his satellite feeds. Within 20 minutes, CNN and Al Jazeera bannered, Pope faces unprecedented state demands. BBC added diplomatic shockwaves, and influencers on TikTok reenacted imaginary courtroom dramas complete with trending audio titled, When They Come for the Pontiff. In Seoul, a commuter glanced at his phone and muttered an expletive that startled 3 dozing passengers. In Lagos, a street vendor paused mid-pour of groundnut stew, wiping hands on apron to scroll headlines. Algorithms bared their teeth and bit down hard on the unfolding story. Still, the world inside the apostolic palace ran on a slower clock, the ecclesial rhythm that asks, what did the carpenter from Nazareth do when stones flew? He stooped. He rode in dust. He addressed accusers as though they might yet become brothers. Leo, recalling that dust script gospel scene, lifted his eyes to Rossi and said in a voice notched perfectly between gentleness and flint, you believe you protect your people. I believe I speak for the voiceless of those same people. Our callings are cousins. Shall we let them converse? Protocol screamed no. Something deeper nodded yes. Rossi swallowed, tasted copper, and gestured toward the oak door Leo indicated. 2 guards followed. Leo waved them off. Leave swords in their scabbards. Truth travels unescorted. The guards froze mid-step, uncertain whether this instruction trumped their security doctrine. Rossi exhaled through the parted door, and for the first time in his career, he entered a room where power stripped itself to story. The chairs in that side chamber were mismatched, one walnut, one pine, like brothers born of different fathers but raised under the same roof. Dust motes performed ballet in a single sun shaft slashing from stained glass. Leo beckoned Rossi to sit. He did, posture rigid as if he expected sudden inquisition. None came. The Pope produced a photo cracked at the corners. 2 teenage boys, one black, one Italian-American, leaning on a chain-link fence laced with neighborhood lore. Me and my brother John, 1971, he said, the day our parish took in 5 Vietnamese families. People called it reckless back then, too. He slid the photo across. Your turn. Rossi reached for his wallet with reflexive caution, as if anyone might snatch state secrets sewn between credit cards. From a sleeve, he slipped a black and white miniature of a young woman in a patched coat, standing beside a steam locomotive, eyes big with unsheltered hope. Maria Cattaneo, my grandmother. Refugee from Trieste, 1946. The parish priest found her a bed in the choir loft. She repaid him by scrubbing pews until her knuckles bled. He paused, emotion knotting his trained diction. I carry this where the world can't redact it. 3 beats of quiet followed, long enough for air to learn a new dialect. Outside, the global feed refreshed 20 times a second, speculating on everything from papal impeachment to secret deals. Inside, a bureaucrat and a bishop of Rome compared wounds. When they emerged 90 minutes later, the attaché stayed in Leo's grasp. Reporters fired questions like metal rain. Neither man answered. A Vatican aide swore she saw Rossi's cheeks glisten. She wondered whether to tweet the detail. She chose instead to weep into her sleeve. While press frenzy escalated, the square beyond the bronze door turned into something no municipal permit could categorize. Tour groups dissolved into prayer circles. A busking violinist switched from pop medleys to a yearning rendition of Amazing Grace. Cell phone towers strained under worship web traffic. In loft apartments overlooking Bernini's colonnade, Insomniacs leaned on railings, marveling at quiet so thick one could hear the Tiber lapping against stone far downstream. Back inside, Archbishop Garcia had barricaded himself in the communications war room, orchestrating crisis strategy. He flipped channels, each newscast a rising crescendo of speculation. Would the Pope be subpoenaed? Could a pontiff be extradited? Which conservative states celebrated the potential silencing of a globalist pontiff, in which human rights organizations warned of a 21st century Galileo moment? His staff pumped out statements designed to calm markets, reassure congregants, and deflect partisan spin. But their keystrokes felt futile next to the raw magnetism of the silent crowd outside. Cardinal Paroline, meanwhile, cornered Sophia Ritchie beside a server rack, voice a rasp. You said he's been speaking too prophetically. I said too clearly, she corrected, rubbing fatigue from her eyes. Prophets confuse people. He's making them understand, and that terrifies them more. A young Jesuit programmer monitoring hashtags interrupted. Look at this hashtag Leo walks now just overtook hashtag F1 qualifying. That never happens. They stared at the screen as if Moses had split not the Red Sea, but the algorithmic tide of cynicism. In editorial rooms worldwide, producers reluctantly ditched scheduled segments on celebrity divorces to cut live to Rome. The bronze door swung open at 2:11 p.m. Pope Leo stood alone. No guard, no bulletproof glass corridor, no bulletins from the Secretary of State. He looked smaller in the open than cameras had ever captured, more slender, more vulnerable. The hush that fell was not unlike the hush in hospital corridors when surgeons step out to speak to waiting families. He spoke softly. Everyone somehow heard. I see my children, Leo began, voice threading through centuries-old acoustics. You stand in sunlight and drizzle and digital glare. You hunger for words that will not vanish at the next swipe. He paused, scanning faces, locking eyes with a teenager holding a cardboard sign that read borders can't block grace. If I have loved loudly, forgive me my volume. If silence keeps the wounded invisible, I must keep speaking. Not because I am brave, ask arthritis about bravery, but because quiet complicity strengthens chains around the already chained. Tiar strict make-up, strict camera optics, strict marble arts. Television anchors, expecting a standoff drama, found themselves narrating Transfiguration. One analyst gasped on open mic. He's defusing a diplomatic war with a bedtime story tone. Then came a moment critics would later call reckless genius. The Pope descended the steps, parted Swiss guards by gently touching halberds like reeds, and walked unarmored into the square's center. A Universalinale. A freelance live streamer captured a young mother press her baby forward. The Pope cupped tiny fingers, forehead creased with longing. His silent blessing vibrated through fiber optic cables and landed in nursery rooms on opposite ends of the globe. In Managua, a grandmother kneeled before a cluttered TV, whispering Spanish intercessions. In Delhi's dawn haze, a Sikh taxi driver propped his phone on the steering wheel and let tears smear his beard as the feed buffered. The next hours blurred. Eucharistic ministers distributed gratis bottles of water labeled Acqua di Pietro, donated by a local bottler who had decided commerce could wait. An imam from a nearby mosque arrived with dates and offered iftar snacks to whoever needed sugar. A London rabbi FaceTimed into a giant LED screen set up by tech-savvy seminarians, chanting Psalm 126 alongside a Welsh gospel choir that had booked flights spontaneously that morning. Drone footage broadcast the square glowing like a colossal lantern lit by human souls. Meanwhile, inside the Secretariat of State, fax machines coughed up urgent condolences from spiritual leaders and thinly veiled threats from certain embassies. A Central European deputy minister called the event Papal Populist Theater. An African president tweeted cautious support, instantly winning trending tiger status for his re-election campaign. China's foreign ministry released a statement praising the humanitarian impulse, while reminding the Vatican to respect the principles of non-interference. Analysts skirted whiplash, parsing geopolitics in real time. Nightfall. The crowd refused dispersal. Roman police, seasoned in corralling soccer riots, found themselves standing by idly as people recited Beatitudes in 15 languages. Young volunteers distributed tea-light candles stamped with the Greek letter phi. Phi for philia, universal love, an idea hatched by two design students from Turin who'd hitchhiked south that afternoon. At 11:07 p.m., something uncanny happened. Bells rang from the campanile of St. Mark's in Venice, hundreds of kilometers away. Nobody had rung them. Later, it emerged a lightning glitch had triggered automated chimes. Conspiracy blogs christened it a miracle. Electronic music DJs in Berlin sampled the audio into club beats titled Pontiff House, which climbed Spotify's viral charts by dawn. Inside the Apostolic Palace's papal study, Rossi stood before an antique mirror, practicing lines for a statement he had no precedent to model. He erased phrases like compliance and jurisdiction, wrote journey, dialogue, grandmother. He glimpsed his reflection and hardly recognized the softening at the corners of his own military sharp eyes. He wondered if compassion was contagious. He suspected yes. Just past midnight, Leo entered, cloak damp from candlelit mist pooling over the square. "Marco," he said, dropping formalities like old armor, "help me draft a letter." For 2 hours they composed on cream stationery the color of sand, where migrants land and collapse. The Pope wrote lines. Rossi edited clauses. The synergy felt suspiciously like friendship. The final text asked, when did mercy become a national threat? When did dignity need a permit? It proposed a round table, 14 equal chairs, olive wood reclaimed from raised groves in Palestine, no cameras, every voice an indispensable instrument. At dawn, drones filmed the letter being hand-delivered to embassy motorcycles parked along Via della Conciliation. By breakfast, 22 capitals signaled tentative openness. Markets, expecting papal exile, rallied on an optimism analysts grudgingly attributed to non-material variables, a tidy phrase for hope. International human rights lawyers who had prepared writs of habeas corpus pivoted to drafting frameworks for the unprecedented Mercy Accord. 3 days later, the gathering convened in a repurposed storage hall adjacent to the Vatican pharmacy. Chairs in a perfect circle around a table fashioned by Italian nuns from olive stumps scorched by bombardments in the Gaza Strip. Attendees, presidents, special envoys, NGO veterans, a Syrian refugee mother named Lamis, an atheist ICU nurse from the Bronx, a Coptic priest who'd survived church bombing in Alexandria, a Pakistani teenager passionate about astrophysics, now stranded by visa bans, and Elias, the tattered coated man whose life had once intersected Leo's on a sleet-bitten curb in South Chicago. Each delegate was handed a simple card. Name, wound, hope. The instructions, truth slower than a headline, kinder than a clapback. Outside, crowds sang spirituals, folk songs, lullabies in languages the Babel algorithm couldn't sort. Street merchants sold rosaries next to protest art prints, but many gifted them away. A French reporter sipped espresso on a roof and observed, "This looks like Woodstock in clerical Latin." Inside, tears sluiced barriers faster than diplomats could raise them. Lamis described losing 2 sons off Lesbos. The nurse confessed how faith grew quiet once ventilators grew loud. Rossi recounted Maria's arrival photo and wept openly, smudging ink on his own documents. A moment captured by a Reuters lens and headline "Bureaucrat Breaks." The Pope listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, his sentences creaked like porch swings at dusk, carrying the pitch of weathered wisdom. The doors finally swung wide. Delegates stepped into camera flash storms arm in arm. No statement issued, no treaties signed. But the world inhaled differently, as though oxygen had been spiked with a rational possibility. Next morning, Leo knelt on wet cobblestones. Drizzle beaded off his papal skullcap. He had no microphone, still thousands heard. With thunderclouds snagging on basilica spires, he confessed collectively, not doctrines but failures. We covered sin, not confessed it. We prized reputation over repentance. If you were wounded by our silence, we repent. A bishop knelt first, then a skeptical anchor, then an agnostic mathematician. then waves upon waves until the square became a forest of bent knees. One young man shouted, "Viva il Papa!" Another shouted, "Viva Chi Soffer!" And the two voices twined into a single chant floated by rain. Global aftershocks logged onto seismographs of culture. At Harvard, a professor scrapped his lecture on post-truth rhetoric and instead streamed footage titled Empathy in real time. At a Jakarta Tech Summit, keynote speakers paused for silent reflection, a novelty at events usually smothered in sponsorship logos. A Tokyo manga artist released a 4-panel strip depicting the Pope as a wandering gardener sowing flowers on barbed wire. It trended on Pixiv for weeks. The Vatican press corps struggled to articulate statistics for intangible phenomena. They issued communiques citing spikes in blood donation signups, orphan sponsorship pledges, and a curious uptick in the phrase, "walk with me," across major languages. Sociologists designed new indexes to quantify collective compassion events, CCE, identifying the Leo Walk as Generation 1. Months rolled by. The annual roundtable became quarterly, then monthly, rotating between Nairobi, Sao Paulo, Warsaw, Manila. Whenever the olive wood table shipped, crowds lined runways to touch its scarred surface the way medieval pilgrims once kissed reliquaries. Governments initially feared PR risks, but soon competed for hosting rights once they noticed tourism surges. Immigration officers received story listening training. Two nations introduced human dignity impact statements to parliamentary procedure. A right-wing pundit fumed on cable news that papists are exporting guilt like a virus. Ratings dipped for his segment. Advertisers pivoted to launch new compassion marketing campaigns. Within the church, the reverberations re-sanded centuries-old furniture. Seminary curricula added trauma-informed pastoral care. Bishops swapped palatial reception rooms for walk-in weekdays at soup kitchens. A cathedral in Munich demolished its VIP pews. Donations redirected from marble renovations to mobile clinics. Skeptics smelled public relations branding. Perhaps it was, and perhaps it wasn't. Motives remained messy, but the clinics nonetheless treated diabetic migrants who previously scheduled dialysis around fear of deportation. Leo himself traveled quietly, eschewing Pope-mobile pomp. He visited detention centers in Arizona, kneeled on plastic chairs beside unaccompanied minors, blessed them in Spanish he'd learned from neighborhood friends decades earlier. He slipped into a Lampedusa fishing hamlet, left a handwritten envelope containing tuition for every local child of undocumented parents. These visits rarely made headline. Sometimes they exploded onto amateur Instagram accounts. Often they passed like stealth comets. The Vatican neither confirmed nor denied, an institutional wink acknowledging that some revolutions prefer candlelight to Klieg lights. Bureaucracy did not dissolve. Inertia fought back. Curial committees drafted cautious guidelines to contain Leo's improvisational compassion. He signed some, vetoed others with marginalia, quoting his mother, "Better to err hugging too tight than too loose." Traditionalist bloggers flayed him as sentimental, globalist, naive. He responded only by sending them signed Bibles. Some returned them, others kept them. And one day, one such blogger slipped into St. Peter's at dawn and cried into his hands until guards placed a gentle palm on his shoulder. Amid this, scandals still erupted. Financial mismanagement, clerical abuse revelations, theological infighting. Each threatened to smear the fragile patina of hope. Leo addressed each bluntly, sometimes naming sins in televised masses to the horror of risk-averse advisors. "A tumor not excised kills the body," he said, "no matter how much perfume you dump on the casket." He formed lay-led tribunals, sold and used Vatican properties to fund reparations, and opened secret archives to independent investigators. Controversies howled. Transparency chilled them into grudging respect. 3 years into this era, at age 72, he felt lungs betray him, wheezes like rust in an old pipe. Doctors spoke in euphemisms. He answered in jokes about Chicago winters being harder than death. He refused prolonged hospitalization. insisted on celebrating Easter Vigil in a wheelchair rolled down the basilica's central aisle. Candles flickered, scripture soared, and he preached only 5 minutes. Resurrection is not an event. It is the stubborn refusal of light to stay buried. If you remember nothing else, remember that. The congregation rose, applause thundered, cameras caught tears in the eyes of seasoned Vatican beat reporters hardened against sentiment. The following Pentecost, he drafted an 11-page exhortation in the margins of his leather Bible, writing longhand by lamplight that made his shadow sprawl like a tired prophet across frescoed walls. He addressed no magisterial authority, footnoted no councils. He titled it, "Let It Speak Louder," echoing Mildred's admonition. The letter wove parables of rust-belt laundromats, refugee toddlers chasing soap bubbles, diplomats relearning lullabies. It concluded, if the church becomes too small for crowns, it may finally become wide enough for Christ. He slid the manuscript into an envelope, sealed it with red wax bearing the fisherman's ring, and tucked it beneath the cracked photo of him and John leaning on that fence under a Chicago sun. By summer, the lung disease worsened. He summoned Rossi, now head of the Mercy Accord Secretariat, to his bedside, teasing, "Marco, you traded subpoenas for stories. That's insider trading of the best kind." He pressed the pectoral cross into Rossi's palms. Relics matter less than the next act of courage. Still, carry this until it teaches you its quiet weight. Rossi, tears unsheathed, promised to guard both relic and revolution. Leo slipped into the great hush on a soft September sunrise as bells tolled prime. The final word on his lips was, unsurprisingly, walk. Vatican radio paused programming. Then Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony filled the airwaves, echoing across piazzas where pilgrims stood silent. That day, global exchanges delayed opening by 1 minute. Airlines offered fee waivers for flights to Rome. Even late-night comedians suspended monologues, airing instead clips of the Pope blessing cats, cracking jokes about deep dish pizza, telling children God probably loves your Lego tower. Funeral week became a living atlas of gratitude. The olive wood table was airlifted to the Basilica forecourt, covered with letters from every continent. Protesters who once vilified Vatican opulence knelt beside cardinals in red. Anarchists shared umbrellas with nuns. Rabbis hummed psalms with Sufi dervishes spinning slowly like galaxies around grief. A secular columnist wrote, "The Pope's body lies in state, but his ideas refuse to remain still." Inside St. Peter's, before the coffin closed, Elias approached, wearing a suit borrowed from a Roman tailor who refused payment. He slipped a scrap of cardboard under the Pope's folded hands. It read simply, "Still walking, courtesy of all the ones you carried." Then he stepped back, wiped tears, and joined a processional that felt less like funeral dirge and more like marathon baton pass. 1 month later, the cracked leather Bible went on display in a modest Vatican Museum alcove. Pilgrims queued 12 hours to trace fingers over margin notes. Among them, a teenager from Manila live-streamed shaky footage to classmates, saying, "These doodles started the biggest group project in history." Museum staff, overwhelmed, installed benches for weary feet. Someone placed Maria Rossi's cracked shoes beneath the display, unannounced, unglassed. Visitors assumed they were part of the exhibition. In a sense, they were the exhibition. The Mercy Accord continued, immune to the death of its catalyst. Successive pontiffs inherited the mantle, some wearing it comfortably, others grudgingly. Civil servants rotated, politicians changed slogans, wars flared and cooled. But the baseline expectation of human-first policy stuck like incense in velvet curtains. An NGO coalition published a decade report revealing a 14% decrease in border-crossing fatalities, a 27% increase in multilateral humanitarian corridors. Economists credited trade deals. Sociologists credited smartphone empathy. Believers credited Leo's walk. Truth, as usual, shrugged off singular narratives. On the 15th anniversary, drones filmed the square at dusk. Candles spelled the word walk in a language readable from space. Astronauts aboard ISS posted the photo with caption, "Compassion visible from orbit tonight." Thousands retweeted under hashtag "Let It Speak Louder." Algorithms smiled, understanding belatedly that kindness, though unmonetizable, is the ultimate clickbait. And still the shoes remain under cracked fresco light, collecting dust and prayers. Tour guides sometimes overlook them, focusing on gilded altars. But a certain kind of pilgrim always spots those worn soles and kneels, recognizing the holy shorthand. Journey begun, journey unfinished, continue without maps. They rise, echoing the old man's whisper that now hums in rail stations, refugee camps, corporate elevators, and anywhere else hearts remember how to spare a beat for strangers. The whisper is frustratingly simple. Too simple for policy papers, too durable for propaganda. And it says generation after generation, in the hush before courage, in the roar after mercy.